Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1843, a series of unusual incidents began to occur at Blackthorn Estate, located approximately 15 miles south of Natchez, Mississippi. The property, encompassing over 2,000 acres of cotton fields and dense woodland, had been in the possession of the Blackwood family since the turn of the century. What transpired within those grounds would remain buried in county records for more than a century, disturbing even the most seasoned historical researchers who uncovered fragments of the truth. Local newspapers from that period mentioned the estate only in passing, noting the peculiar circumstances surrounding the Blackwood family's agricultural prosperity, despite a blight affecting neighboring plantations. According to land registry documents filed with the Adams County Clerk's Office, the property had been expanding steadily, acquiring adjacent lands from families who left the area under what witnesses described as unsettling conditions. The estate was primarily managed by Eleanor Blackwood, who assumed control following her father's passing in 1838. County records describe her as unmarried, of sound mind and considerable education, having studied in Philadelphia before returning to manage family interests. What these formal descriptions failed to capture was the atmosphere of dread that surrounded the woman, according to accounts collected decades later from former servants and neighboring families. Eleanor lived at the estate with her two younger brothers, Thomas and William. Public records show that Thomas, the middle sibling, had briefly attended West Point before returning home under unclear circumstances in 1839. William, the youngest, appears in few official documents beyond his birth record and is described in a physician's notes as possessing a frail constitution and nervous disposition. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not what was officially documented, but what remained unspoken for decades. The Blackwood estate maintained a population of approximately 70 enslaved persons, according to census records, a number that remained unusually stable, despite neighboring plantations reporting declining numbers due to disease and harsh conditions throughout the region. It was not until 1869, years after the Civil War, that a former house servant named Harriet provided a statement to a Freedmen's Bureau representative that would later be sealed and forgotten in a government archive. Her testimony described conditions at Blackwood Estate that defied conventional understanding of even the brutal plantation system of the antebellum South. According to the transcript, Harriet stated, "Miss Eleanor kept books on everyone, not just work records like other places. She had measurements and dates and pairings all written down like she was breeding cattle. The brothers never spoke against her, no matter what she ordered them to do." This statement remained buried in obscure archives until 1865, when Professor James Merritt of Tufts University discovered it while researching economic practices of pre-war Mississippi plantations. What he found led him to abandon his original research focus entirely, as he wrote in a private letter to a colleague, "I have encountered something that defies categorization within our historical framework. The Blackwood case represents something beyond mere economic exploitation, something pathological that has been deliberately erased from local memory." The morning of March 15, 1845, began like any other on the Blackwood estate. The air carried the heaviness of approaching rain, and workers had been in the fields since before dawn. Inside the main house, built in the Greek Revival style common among wealthy landowners, Eleanor Blackwood sat at her father's old mahogany desk, reviewing ledgers with meticulous attention to detail. At 30 years of age, Eleanor presented a striking figure, according to descriptions in letters exchanged between neighboring plantation mistresses. Tall, with auburn hair typically worn in a severe style, she was noted for her unusual education and mannerisms more suited to business than society. Local records indicate she had rejected several marriage proposals from prominent families, causing considerable scandal, but eventually leading the community to regard her as an eccentric spinster rather than a suitable match. That particular morning, according to kitchen records later recovered, she had requested her breakfast be served in the study rather than the dining room, where her brothers typically ate together. This small deviation from routine marked the beginning of what would become a pivotal day in the estate's dark history. Thomas Blackwood, 27 years of age, had been overseeing the eastern fields for the previous 3 seasons. County agricultural reports note that those particular acres had yielded exceptional harvest, worthy of regional recognition, though Thomas himself never appeared at any agricultural society meetings to receive such acknowledgements. Descriptions from former employees collected decades later characterize him as increasingly withdrawn, with a haunted demeanor that worsened following private meetings with his sister. William, the youngest at 24, handled correspondence and accounts under Eleanor's supervision. A diary belonging to a neighboring plantation owner's daughter, Margaret Holbrook, describes an encounter with William at a Christmas gathering in 1844. The youngest Blackwood boy attended with his sister, though he spoke hardly 10 words the entire evening. When Eleanor engaged in conversation with the Wilkinson family, I observed him standing apart, his hands trembling so severely he spilled his drink. When I inquired after his health, he looked at me with such naked terror that I nearly called for my father. Before he could respond, his sister appeared at his side, and he fell silent entirely. What transpired within the Blackwood household remained largely invisible to outside observers. The estate operated as a nearly self-contained entity, with few visitors permitted beyond the main gate. Deliveries were received at an outbuilding near the entrance, and even the local minister noted in parish records that his seasonal visits were unexpectedly brief and conducted primarily in the formal parlour, with no access permitted to other household members. According to household inventory records filed after Eleanor's eventual death, the main house contained 22 rooms, including an unusual number of locked storage areas and what was described as a medical room equipped with instruments more typically found in hospital settings than private residences. A ledger recovered from this room contained entries that, according to Professor Merritt's notes, reveal a systematic approach to human reproduction that treats people as agricultural stock, with notations on physical characteristics, bloodlines, and productive capacity that chill the reader to the bone. The adjacent property owner to the west, Colonel James Thornton, noted in his personal journal in February 1845 that he had observed unusual structures being erected in the remote southern section of the Blackwood property, visible only from the highest point of my land. Construction appears to be conducted at night, with torches visible through the trees. When I inquired about this activity, Miss Blackwood informed me they were merely improving drainage to reclaim swampland, though the topography of that area contains no significant wetlands to my knowledge. What Colonel Thornton observed would later become central to the disturbing narrative that eventually emerged. The structures, according to architectural assessments conducted in 1866 after the property had changed hands, appeared to be a series of connected outbuildings designed with unusual attention to sound suppression and isolation, with thick walls and few windows resembling in some aspects certain hospital wards for the mentally afflicted, though lacking any apparent therapeutic purpose. The events of March 1845 would never be fully documented in any official record, but fragments of evidence suggest a significant confrontation occurred between Eleanor and her brother Thomas. A house servant's deposition, given to a northern journalist in 1868 but never published, described shouting from the master's study, with the younger master's voice raised in a manner never before heard on the property. The mistress's response was not raised, but carried throughout the house nonetheless, followed by a silence more terrible than the argument. What Thomas had discovered, according to Professor Merritt's reconstruction of events, appears to have been the full extent of his sister's breeding program. not just its existence, which he likely knew about, but specific details regarding his own unwitting participation in it. Household records indicate that Thomas had been encouraged by Eleanor to inspect certain aspects of the operation, presumably to maintain the illusion of normal plantation oversight while keeping him ignorant of the broader pattern. According to entries in Eleanor's personal journal, recovered from a hidden compartment in her desk in 1866, Thomas had found and broken into a locked cabinet containing detailed genealogical charts, medical records, and what she referred to as breeding projections for the coming decade. The specific contents of these documents were never fully described in any surviving record. As Professor Merritt noted, they were too disturbing to be included in any academic publication and should be secured against public access indefinitely. What is known from estate financial records is that the Blackwood plantation had developed what Eleanor's ledgers clinically termed bloodline management, that treated human beings as livestock to be selectively bred. The full horror of this system, beyond its inherent dehumanization, lay in her detailed documentation of forcing her own brothers to participate, sometimes unknowingly, in what she coldly referred to as genetic contribution to the property assets. The March confrontation marked a turning point. Thomas's name disappears from daily management records after this date, though he remained on the property. Household purchase orders from Natchez merchants show an increase in the acquisition of certain medicinal substances, including laudanum and other sedatives. A physician from Natchez, Dr. Samuel Whitfield, recorded in his visit log a series of calls to the Blackwood estate to treat nervous exhaustion in the younger male members of the household, though no specific treatments were noted. William's deterioration accelerated following these events. Parish records note his absence from Easter services that April, with Eleanor informing the minister that he was indisposed with a persistent fever. No further public sightings of William are recorded until August, when a shopkeeper in Natchez noted in his customer ledger that the younger Blackwood boy appeared greatly altered, thin to the point of emaciation and requiring assistance to walk, accompanied by his sister, who conducted all business matters while he remained silent. Throughout this period, Eleanor's management of the estate continued with apparent normalcy. Cotton yields remained high, tax payments were processed punctually, and her correspondence with cotton brokers in New Orleans shows no disruption in business operations. Yet behind this facade of agricultural productivity, according to testimony later collected from former workers, the atmosphere of the plantation had transformed into something even more oppressive. Those who returned were reportedly changed in manner, speaking little and avoiding eye contact with others. Medical records kept by Eleanor show an unusual pattern of pregnancies, births, and infant mortality, all documented with a clinical detachment that, as Professor Merritt noted, reveals a mind viewing human reproduction as merely another agricultural process to be optimized. The system Eleanor had established combined the worst aspects of plantation slavery with a coldly, scientific approach to human breeding that anticipated the eugenics movements that would emerge decades later. Harriet's testimony describes workers being relocated between different areas of the property with increasing frequency, with certain individuals, particularly women of childbearing age, kept isolated in the southern outbuildings for extended periods. What made her case unique, even within the brutal context of the antebellum South, was her extension of this control to her own family members, using what surviving records suggest was a combination of psychological manipulation, social isolation, and eventually chemical sedation to maintain their compliance. By June 1845, Thomas appears to have been completely removed from management duties. Estate records show the hiring of an overseer named Jeremiah Coates, previously employed at a plantation 30 miles downriver, who assumed responsibility for field operations. Coates's personal correspondence, discovered in a collection of family papers donated to the Mississippi Historical Society in 1957, reveals his growing unease with the operation. In a letter to his brother, dated July 1845, Coates wrote, The position pays considerably above the standard rate, which initially appeared fortunate. I now understand why the premium is necessary. The mistress has established a system unlike any I have encountered previously. With detailed records and procedures I'm expected to follow precisely. What occurs in the South Quarter is not spoken of directly, but I have observed enough to question whether I can, in good conscience, continue this employment beyond the harvest season. The brothers are rarely seen, and when they appear, they behave more like inmates than masters. Coates would remain at the estate for only 4 months before departing suddenly in September. His final letter mentions conditions that no Christian man could countenance, without specifying details. County employment records show he relocated to Tennessee shortly thereafter, never returning to Mississippi. The neighboring Thornton plantation continued to document unusual activities. In an August entry, Colonel Thornton noted, "Unusual movement of wagons to and from the Blackwood property during night hours. When encountered on the county road, the drivers avoid all conversation and shield their cargo from view. I have brought this matter to the attention of the sheriff, who seemed reluctant to investigate, suggesting that the Blackwood woman's eccentricities are best left unexamined so long as taxes are paid and no laws openly broken." This reluctance of local authorities to investigate the Blackwood estate appears repeatedly in historical records. Eleanor's position as a substantial landowner, taxpayer, and agricultural producer afforded her a degree of protection from scrutiny, particularly given the isolated nature of the property and the era's limited legal oversight of plantation operations. The few individuals who raised concerns found themselves subtly discouraged from pursuing inquiries through what Professor Merritt described as a combination of economic pressure, social ostracism, and in at least 2 documented cases, unexplained accidents befalling particularly persistent questioners. By autumn 1845, both Thomas and William were effectively prisoners within the estate, according to household accounts pieced together from multiple sources. Their quarters had been relocated from the family wing to rooms in the east section of the house, an area that household inventories show had been modified with reinforced doors and shuttered windows. Medical supplies continued to be delivered regularly from Natchez, with Eleanor's personal records showing detailed tracking of dosages administered to her brothers, typically coinciding with what she termed contribution days in her clinical nomenclature. The full extent of what occurred during these contribution days was never explicitly documented in any surviving record, though Professor Merritt's research suggests a systematic program of forced reproduction involving both brothers. Eleanor's journals contain oblique references to securing genetic advantages and maintaining bloodline quality through what she termed controlled introduction of family traits. The clinical language masks what was, in essence, a grotesque violation of both her brothers and the enslaved women selected for her program. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not only the nature of these violations, but the methodical, pseudo-scientific approach Eleanor applied to human suffering. Her ledgers show careful tracking of pregnancies, births, and subsequent development of children, with notations evaluating physical characteristics, temperament, and other traits she deemed valuable. Those children who met her criteria were designated for what she termed program continuation, while others were assigned to general fieldwork, or in some cases sold to other plantations, with her records noting they were unsuitable for breeding objectives. In October 1845, a significant change occurred in the household routine. Eleanor's journal contains an entry noting that tea has become increasingly difficult to manage despite increased sedation, requiring physical restraint during yesterday's collection procedure. W remains compliant, but his physical condition deteriorates despite nutritional supplements, must consider program adjustments to maintain viability. The program adjustments appeared to involve bringing in a new physician, Dr. James Ellsworth, previously associated with an asylum in Maryland. County records show he received a substantial payment from the Blackwood estate in November 1845, listed ambiguously as professional consultation services. No official record of his findings exists, but Eleanor's subsequent journal entries suggest he provided guidance on more effective sedation protocols and restraint methods disguised as medical treatments for nervous disorders. Throughout this period, the cotton production of the estate continued unabated. Shipping records from New Orleans show the Blackwood plantation maintained output levels that ranked among the highest in the county. This economic success provided Eleanor with both the resources to continue her program and the social insulation that prevented outside interference. As Professor Merritt noted in his analysis, the commercial success of the operation served as both means and cover for the atrocities occurring behind the estate walls, demonstrating how economic productivity often shielded the worst abuses of the plantation system from scrutiny. By December 1845, William's health had deteriorated to a critical point. A letter from Dr. Ellsworth to Eleanor, preserved in county records as part of later estate litigation, advised that the younger subject's condition cannot sustain current protocols without risk of permanent damage or fatality. Recommend reduction in frequency of procedures and increased recovery periods. Eleanor's journal shows she dismissed this recommendation, noting coldly that W's genetic contribution remains essential to Phase 3 objectives, regardless of personal cost. The winter of 1845 brought unusually cold weather to the region, according to meteorological records maintained by a Natchez Scientific Society. The Blackwood estate, like others in the area, faced challenges maintaining adequate heating and preventing illness among workers. Eleanor's records show increased mortality in the southern quarters, though her concern appears limited to the impact on her breeding program rather than human suffering. Thomas's situation reached a critical point in late December. Household staff accounts, collected years later, describe an incident in which he broke free from his room during a moment of reduced sedation, making his way to Eleanor's study, where a violent confrontation occurred. No official record documents this event, but Eleanor's journal contains a cryptic entry dated December 27th. T subdued after unfortunate incident. Damage to study materials substantial, but program documentation secured. Increased security measures implemented. T relocated to secure facility in Southern Complex for intensive management. This secure facility appears to have been a specially constructed building within the complex Colonel Thornton had observed earlier that year. Architectural assessments conducted after the war described it as a structure combining elements of medical isolation wards and secure holding facilities, with rooms designed for individual confinement and a central area equipped similarly to a medical theatre, though serving no apparent therapeutic purpose. Thomas would remain confined in this facility for the duration of his life, according to estate records. His name appears only in Eleanor's private documentation after this point, with no further public record of his existence. William, meanwhile, continued to decline rapidly. By February 1846, Eleanor's journal notes that W requires constant medical supervision between procedures and expresses concern that extraction quality shows marked deterioration despite stimulants. The full horror of what occurred at the Blackwood estate would never be completely documented. Even Professor Merritt, after years of research, noted that significant aspects of the operation remain mercifully obscure, with gaps in the historical record that perhaps should not be filled. What can be pieced together from surviving evidence suggests a systematic program of human breeding that combined the worst aspects of slavery with Eleanor's distorted application of emerging theories of heredity and selective breeding, decades before such concepts gained wider scientific attention. By spring 1846, William's condition had deteriorated beyond recovery. Parish death records show he passed on April 4th, with the official cause listed as consumption and nervous exhaustion. He was buried in the family plot with a small private ceremony, attended only by Eleanor and the minister, according to church records. No obituary appeared in local newspapers, and his passing received no public acknowledgement beyond the minimum legal documentation. Thomas's fate remained hidden from public view entirely. Eleanor's private records indicate he remained in confinement, with his contributions to the program continuing under heavy sedation. The last dated entry referring to him comes in August 1846, noting that tea's usefulness diminishes as resistance increases despite chemical management. Alternative arrangements under consideration. No subsequent mention of Thomas appears in any recovered document, suggesting either his death or removal to another location not documented in surviving records. Eleanor continued to manage the estate with apparent success for several more years. Agricultural production remained high, and her business correspondence shows expanding connections with cotton merchants throughout the South. Yet behind this facade of normality, according to accounts later collected from those who escaped the property, her breeding program continued and expanded, now focused entirely on the enslaved population, with no further mention of her brother's involvement. The Blackwood case might have remained entirely hidden from history were it not for the Civil War and its aftermath. Union forces occupied Natchez in 1863, and records show the Blackwood estate was inspected as part of efforts to identify property for potential confiscation. The initial military report notes only that the plantation was well maintained but currently unoccupied, with the owner reportedly having relocated to relatives in Georgia prior to our arrival. No mention is made of the southern complex or any unusual findings, suggesting either a superficial inspection or deliberate omission from official documentation. It was not until 1865, during Reconstruction, that a more thorough investigation occurred. His official report, filed in July 1865, but subsequently classified and removed from public access, described discoveries that he characterized as evidence of systematic atrocities exceeding conventional understanding of plantation abuses, suggesting a mind diseased beyond normal human comprehension. The southern complex, by then partially abandoned, contained what Pierce described as medical equipment arranged for human reproductive procedures, detailed records of forced breeding spanning multiple generations, and evidence of confinement facilities that can only be described as designed for the purpose of human husbandry in its most literal and horrific sense. His report recommended that certain structures be demolished and records secured to prevent further trauma to survivors and their descendants. Eleanor Blackwood herself never faced justice for her actions. A Freedmen's Bureau agent named Jonathan Pierce, responding to reports from formerly enslaved people who had fled the property, conducted a detailed examination of the estate. Records indicate she fled Mississippi in 1864 as Union forces approached, taking significant financial assets but leaving behind most estate records and property. A brief mention in the Atlanta newspaper in 1867 notes the death of E. No legal proceedings were ever initiated against her, and much of the evidence of her crimes was deliberately suppressed by authorities who, according to Professor Merritt's assessment, deemed the case too disturbing for public knowledge and potentially damaging to post-war reconciliation efforts. The Blackwood estate itself was eventually sold in 1868 to a northern investor who converted it to a much smaller farming operation, demolishing many of the original structures, including the entire southern complex. Blackwood, formerly of Mississippi, with no further details provided. The main house burned under mysterious circumstances in 1871, destroying any remaining records stored there. The land would change hands multiple times over subsequent decades, with local residents reporting persistent unease about the property despite no visible remnants of its dark history. The story might have remained completely buried were it not for Professor Merritt's accidental discovery of Harriet's testimony in archived Freedmen's Bureau records in 1963. His subsequent research, conducted quietly over 5 years, assembled the fragments of evidence from dispersed sources, including county records, private correspondence, medical orders, shipping manifests, and architectural assessments. The resulting monograph, completed in 1968, but never published due to what his academic correspondence describes as ethical concerns regarding the potential impact of such disturbing historical material, remained in university archives, accessible only to qualified historical researchers with specific authorization. In 1969, the last physical connection to the case disappeared when the remains of the Blackwood family cemetery were relocated during highway construction. The graves moved to a public cemetery with simple markers bearing only names and dates, no family connection indicated. The land where the plantation once stood is now divided among several modern farms and a small industrial park, with no historical marker or acknowledgement of what occurred there. What makes the Blackwood case uniquely disturbing, even within the brutal context of plantation slavery, is the combination of systematic cruelty with clinical methodology, applied not only to enslaved persons, but extended to the perpetrator's own family members. Eleanor's writings reveal a mind that viewed all human beings, including her brothers, as mere biological resources to be utilized according to her designs, with no recognition of humanity, dignity, or suffering. As Professor Merritt noted in his final assessment, sealed with his research materials, the horror of the Blackwood case lies not in physical violence, though that certainly occurred, but in the cold, methodical denial of humanity that allowed Eleanor to document her atrocities as though they were merely agricultural innovations. Perhaps most disturbing is the recognition that her approach, while extreme, represents an extension of the same dehumanizing logic that underpinned the entire plantation system, a reminder that institutional evil often enables and conceals individual pathology. Today, no visible trace remains of Blackthorn Estate or the atrocities committed there. The land has been transformed, the buildings demolished, the records scattered or destroyed. Yet the echo of what occurred continues to resonate through the fragments of evidence that survived, a reminder of capacity for calculated cruelty that can hide behind facades of civilization and productivity. The story of Eleanor Blackwood and her brothers represents not supernatural horror, but something perhaps more disturbing. The horror of human potential corrupted beyond recognition, operating within systems that enable rather than constrain the worst aspects of our nature. It reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those that emerge from darkness, but those that operate in broad daylight, their actions obscured not by shadows, but by the willful blindness of the societies that harbor them. To this day, workers on the properties that once formed the Blackwood Estate report an unexplained sense of unease in certain areas, particularly near the southern border where the specialized facilities once stood. Nothing visible remains to mark the location, yet something intangible persists, perhaps only in human memory and the cultural transmission of trauma, or perhaps something more fundamentally imprinted on the landscape itself, a resonance of suffering that time has not fully erased. The case files assembled by Professor Merritt remain sealed in university archives, accessible only under restricted conditions that he himself established before his death in 1969. The Blackwood case represents not just historical atrocity, but a glimpse into an abyss of human potential that few are equipped to contemplate without lasting damage to their understanding of our shared humanity. The sound that still echoes from Blackthorn Estate is not a ghostly wail or supernatural manifestation, but something perhaps more haunting, the silence of stories deliberately buried, of suffering unacknowledged, of justice never served, and of wounds that, generations later, remain unhealed in the collective memory of a place and its people. His final note regarding the collection reads simply, "Some chapters of human history, though they must be preserved for their cautionary value, perhaps should never be fully opened to public view." In 1952, during excavation for a manufacturing facility near the southern edge of what was once Blackwood property, construction workers uncovered a series of underground chambers not documented in any county survey. According to a foreman's report filed with local authorities, but subsequently removed from public records, the chambers contained evidence of medical procedures inconsistent with any standard practice, along with human remains showing signs of prolonged confinement. The discovery was quickly covered up, with county officials citing historical sensitivity and community relations concerns as justification for halting any investigation and resuming construction after the chambers were hastily filled with concrete. Jenkins described finding iron fixtures mounted to stone walls, with leather restraints still attached, and glass containers holding substances that had long since deteriorated. Most disturbing was his account of a room containing what appeared to be medical records, preserved somehow despite the dampness, with detailed notations about procedures performed on individuals identified only by numbers and physical characteristics. According to Jenkins, these materials were removed by county officials and never publicly acknowledged. A worker present during this discovery, Henry Jenkins, provided a statement to a local historian in 1967, shortly before his death. The historical obscurity of the Blackwood case reflects a broader pattern observed by Professor Merritt in his private research notes. Certain historical atrocities, particularly those that combine elements we prefer to keep conceptually separate, family betrayal, medical exploitation, sexual violation, and systematic dehumanization, seem to generate a collective impulse toward forgetting. They challenge not just our understanding of particular historical contexts, but our fundamental conception of human potential and limitations. This collective forgetting extended beyond official records to community memory. Interviews conducted with longtime Natchez residents in the 1950s showed a curious pattern of omission regarding the Blackwood family and estate. When specifically questioned about the property, respondents frequently exhibited what researchers termed directed avoidance, changing the subject or claiming ignorance despite demonstrating detailed knowledge of other historical properties in the area. This suggests not simple forgetting but active suppression of memory, a community-wide agreement to excise certain elements from their shared history. In 1847, following William's death and Thomas's disappearance from public record, Eleanor's management of the estate entered what her private journals called Phase 3 implementation. Agricultural records show continued prosperity, with cotton production remaining among the highest in Adams County. Behind this economic facade, however, her breeding program continued with increasingly refined methodology. A ledger discovered in 1967 during renovation of the county courthouse, apparently misfiled decades earlier among tax records, contained what appeared to be Eleanor's classification system for what she clinically termed breeding stock. Individuals were categorized by physical characteristics, temperament, work capacity, and what she called reproductive efficiency, with detailed tracking across 3 generations. The document includes notations regarding line improvements achieved through what she termed controlled selection and targeted trait enhancement. The clinical language masks what was, in reality, a program of forced human reproduction conducted with methodical cruelty. Eleanor's notes indicate that by 1848 she had established what she considered 8 distinct genetic lines within the plantation population, each cultivated for specific traits she deemed valuable. Those who failed to meet her criteria were frequently sold to other plantations, their departure recorded in her ledgers with the same dispassionate notation she applied to livestock deemed unsuitable. What distinguished Eleanor's program from the general brutality of plantation slavery was not just its methodical nature, but its pseudoscientific framework. Her journals reference theories of heredity that predated formal genetics by decades, suggesting she had accessed medical and scientific texts well beyond typical plantation libraries. References to correspondences with certain European physicians appear in her records, though no surviving letters have been discovered. These connections suggest her isolation was intellectual rather than geographical, with her remote Mississippi plantation serving as a laboratory for theories too disturbing to be openly acknowledged in scientific circles of the period. In May 1848, a visiting cotton broker from New Orleans named James Harrington made a brief reference to the Blackwood estate in his business diary. He noted that the Blackwood woman continues to achieve remarkable productivity despite regional challenges, though the methods by which this is accomplished remain obscured from visitors. I was permitted no further than the formal parlour and office, with other areas of the property explicitly designated as inaccessible. The atmosphere of the house struck me as unusually sterile and institutional, more reminiscent of a hospital than a plantation home. By 1849, Eleanor had established what her records refer to as controlled living environments for different categories of workers. Agricultural productivity records filed with county authorities show specialized work groups assigned to different areas of the estate, with detailed tracking of output and efficiency. What these public documents obscured was the breeding program underlying these assignments, with Eleanor's private records showing how individuals were grouped to facilitate her controlled reproduction protocols. The human cost of this program can only be glimpsed through fragmentary evidence. Medical records Eleanor maintained show high rates of maternal mortality, infant deaths, and what she clinically termed psychological deterioration among those subjected to her regime. Yet these outcomes appear in her notes merely as technical challenges to be overcome through adjusted protocols rather than human suffering to be addressed. In October 1849, a letter from Dr. Ellsworth, preserved among Eleanor's papers, indicates growing concern about the program's sustainability. While your methods have achieved remarkable consistency in selected traits, the increasing instability observed in subjects raises questions about long-term viability. The psychological deterioration noted in your most recent report suggests limits to human adaptability under current protocols that may not be overcome through procedural adjustments alone. Eleanor's response, drafted but perhaps never sent, dismisses these concerns. Your medical perspective remains constrained by conventional assumptions regarding human capacity and limitation. The temporary discomfort of individuals must be weighed against the multi-generational improvements being established. Those unable to adapt represent expected wastage in any systematic improvement program. This callous dismissal of suffering as expected wastage encapsulates the horror at the core of the Blackwood case. Not just the physical and psychological torture inflicted on countless individuals, but the cold rationality with which it was justified. Eleanor viewed human beings as merely biological material to be manipulated, their pain irrelevant except as a technical obstacle to be overcome. By 1850, rumors about unusual practices at the Blackwood estate had begun to circulate among neighboring plantations, though no formal investigations were initiated. A letter from Colonel Thornton to the county sheriff, discovered among court records in 1965, expresses concern about unsettling reports from workers who have fled the Blackwood property, including allegations of medical procedures performed without appropriate qualification or purpose. The sheriff's response, if any was made, has not survived in official records. This lack of official response reflects the limited legal and social accountability governing plantations in the antebellum South. As a female property owner managing a productive estate, Eleanor occupied an unusual social position that combined vulnerability, as a woman operating outside normal gender expectations, with substantial economic power. This ambiguous status may have contributed to official reluctance to investigate allegations that, if proven, would have disturbed not just the specific case, but broader assumptions about plantation management and oversight. Throughout 1850 and 1851, Eleanor's program continued with minimal outside interference. Agricultural records show continued productivity, while her private documentation details further refinements to her breeding protocols. A ledger dated January 1851 contains a notation indicating that T-derived lines continue to show superior characteristics despite original source termination, suggesting Thomas had died or been permanently removed from the program by this point. No record of Thomas's death appears in any official document, nor is there evidence of burial on the estate. This absence itself speaks to the completeness of Eleanor's control over the property and its operations. Her brother, once legally co-owner of the estate, had been so thoroughly removed from public record that his ultimate fate could be obscured entirely. In July 1851, a significant change occurred in Eleanor's management approach. Her journals reference an unexpected development requiring program reassessment, though specific details are obscured by her increasingly coded language. Subsequent entries suggest a shift toward what she termed self-sustaining bloodlines, with reduced direct oversight, possibly indicating health problems that limited her personal involvement in day-to-day operations. This supposition is supported by a letter from Dr. Ellsworth dated August 1851, referring to your condition and recommending reduced exertion and regular application of the prescribed treatments. No specific diagnosis is mentioned, but subsequent correspondence indicates declining health, requiring increasing medication over the following years. Despite her apparent physical deterioration, Eleanor maintained strict control over the estate through increasingly detailed written protocols followed by overseers and selected workers who had been elevated to management positions. Her journals from this period show growing preoccupation with creating systems that would outlast her personal oversight, a disturbing indication that she viewed her breeding program not as a personal project, but as an enterprise that should continue independently. By 1853, Eleanor's health had declined significantly according to Dr. Ellsworth's records, with regular prescriptions for pain management suggesting a serious, possibly terminal condition. Yet agricultural production remained high, and her breeding program continued under the supervision of individuals she had selected and trained to implement her protocols. Her final journal entries show less attention to day-to-day operations and more concern with what she termed legacy security, ensuring her records and methods would be preserved. In March 1854, parish records note Eleanor's death from what was listed as consumption and feminine weakness, a common diagnosis that could have covered any number of actual conditions. Unlike her brother William, whose death warranted only minimal acknowledgement, Eleanor received a formal funeral attended by regional business associates and neighbouring property owners. The sermon, preserved in the minister's records, makes no mention of her unusual management methods, instead praising her uncommon dedication to agricultural improvement and remarkable independence of spirit. Phrases that take on disturbing dimensions when viewed in light of what is now known about her activities. Following her death, the estate passed to a cousin from the maternal line, Charles Harrington, who had previously had minimal contact with the Mississippi branch of the family. Correspondence between Harrington and his legal representatives, discovered in a collection of business papers donated to the state archives in 1959, shows his initial confusion regarding certain aspects of the estate's operation. In the letter dated May 1854, Harrington writes, "Upon review of the property, I have encountered operational structures unlike any I have previously observed in agricultural contexts. The southern section in particular contains facilities whose purpose remains unclear despite explanations offered by the current overseer. Certain record-keeping practices similarly defy conventional understanding. I request your presence at the estate at your earliest convenience to advise on appropriate continuance or modification of existing systems." Harrington's subsequent correspondence suggests growing disturbance as he gained greater understanding of what he had inherited. By June 1854, his letters indicate a decision to substantially reorganize estate operations and discontinue certain specialized practices initiated by the previous owner. This reorganization apparently included dismantling much of the southern complex, with county work orders showing substantial demolition and reconstruction over the following months. The breeding program Eleanor had established did not survive her death intact, though its effects would continue to impact the lives of those subjected to it for generations. Harrington, while discontinuing the most extreme aspects of the system, maintained ownership of the people Eleanor had treated as experimental subjects, now integrated into more conventional plantation operations. The specialized facilities were repurposed or demolished, but the human beings bred and categorized under Eleanor's protocols remained enslaved, their bodily autonomy still violated, though in less systematized ways. This transition represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The way Eleanor's extreme cruelty, once removed, gave way not to justice or remedy, but simply to more typical forms of exploitation. The individuals who had suffered under her breeding program received no acknowledgement of what had been done to them, no compensation, no opportunity for healing or recovery beyond the cessation of the most extreme abuses. The Blackwood estate continued to operate under Harrington's management until the Civil War brought significant changes to the region. Union forces occupied Natchez in 1863, as previously noted, and records indicate the plantation was abandoned shortly before their arrival, with Harrington relocating to family properties in Georgia and taking significant assets with him. The full scope of what occurred at Blackthorn Estate might never have come to light had it not been for the testimony of survivors recorded by Freedmen's Bureau agents during Reconstruction. These accounts, fragmentary and often recorded by agents uncertain how to categorize what they were hearing, nevertheless provide the most direct window into the human experience of Eleanor's program. One such account, given by a woman identified only as Martha, who'd been born on the estate around 1830, describes the methodical nature of the breeding program. Miss Eleanor had books for everybody, not just workbooks, but body books. She measured and weighed and wrote down everything about a person from the day they was born. She decided who would be paired with who, and there wasn't no saying no. Some women were kept separate in the South buildings, only for breeding and not for field work. If babies didn't look right to her, sometimes they'd disappear. She said she was making improvements, like we was crops instead of people. Another survivor, identified as Samuel, described the role of Eleanor's brothers in the program. The mistress made her own brothers part of her breeding plans. The younger one, he was sickly and afraid, did whatever she told him. The older one fought back for a while, but she had ways of making people do what she wanted. Medicines that made you confused, not knowing what was happening. Later on, he was kept in the South buildings and wasn't seen much around the main house anymore. Folks who worked in those buildings said terrible things happened there, medical things like you do to animals. These testimonies, recorded by agents attempting to document the transition from slavery to freedom, represent the only direct accounts from those who experienced Eleanor's program firsthand. Their stories, preserved in archives yet largely excluded from mainstream historical narratives of the period, provide a powerful counterpoint to the clinical documentation found in Eleanor's own records, reminding us that behind each entry in her breeding ledgers was a human being subjected to calculated cruelty. The long-term impact of Eleanor's program extended beyond the immediate suffering of those directly subjected to it. Genealogical research conducted in the 1970s by descendants of those enslaved at Blackthorn Estate revealed patterns of relationship and heredity that bore the imprint of Eleanor's selective breeding efforts 3 generations later. Certain physical characteristics appeared with unusual frequency within family lines, and oral histories preserved among descendants contained references to ancestors being selected or paired according to particular traits. These echoes of Eleanor's program in the bodies and family histories of descendants represent one of its most disturbing legacies: the way systematic violation of bodily autonomy can create intergenerational impacts that persist long after the direct perpetrator is gone. Unlike conventional historical atrocities that end when the acts themselves cease, Eleanor's manipulation of human reproduction created effects that continued to unfold through subsequent generations, a biological legacy of violation inscribed in the very genetic makeup of descendants. Professor Merritt's research, conducted in the 1960s, faced significant challenges beyond the fragmented nature of historical evidence. His academic correspondence reveals concerns about the ethical implications of publishing his findings, with particular attention to the potential impact on descendants of those victimized at Blackthorn Estate. In a letter to a colleague dated February 1968, he wrote, "While historical truth demands acknowledgement, I find myself increasingly troubled by questions of consent and agency in relation to this particular history. Those who suffered under Eleanor Blackwood's regime had no choice in their participation. Do their descendants now have the right to decide whether that suffering becomes public knowledge? Does the historian's obligation to document outweigh potential harms that documentation might cause to living individuals?" These ethical questions led Merritt to ultimately restrict access to his completed research, depositing his materials in university archives with specific limitations on who could access them and under what circumstances. His decision reflects the exceptional nature of the Blackwood case, a historical atrocity so disturbing in its implications that even its documentation raises profound ethical concerns. The land where Blackthorn Estate once stood has been transformed over subsequent generations, divided and redeveloped multiple times, with no physical marker acknowledging what occurred there. A folklore study conducted in Adams County in 1972 recorded stories told among local residents about a witch woman who bred people like animals, and warnings about certain areas where the ground remembers bad things even when the buildings are gone. These narratives, while lacking historical specificity, nevertheless preserve an emotional truth about the site, a recognition that some violations are so profound they leave a kind of psychic residue that outlasts physical evidence. Yet something of its history persists in local memory, transmitted through generations in forms that often blur historical fact with cautionary legend. This persistence of memory, however transformed by time and retelling, represents both the resilience of truth against efforts to suppress it and the limitations of conventional historical documentation in capturing certain kinds of horror. Eleanor Blackwood's clinical records provide evidence of what was done, but cannot fully convey the human experience of those subjected to her program. The fragmented testimonies of survivors offer glimpses of that experience, but are incomplete and mediated through the perspectives of those who recorded them. The folk memories preserved in local tradition lack factual accuracy, but perhaps capture emotional truths about the events that more formal documentation misses. Taken together, these multiple, incomplete perspectives offer not a comprehensive account of what occurred at Blackthorn Estate, but a series of partial views that collectively gesture toward a horror that remains, in some fundamental sense, beyond complete historical reconstruction. Some aspects of the case remain mercifully obscure, known only through their echoes and after-effects rather than direct documentation. What makes the Blackwood case uniquely disturbing, even among histories of plantation atrocities, is not just the nature of the violations committed, but their methodical, pseudo-scientific character. Eleanor Blackwood was not simply a cruel mistress acting from impulse or conventional prejudice, but someone who developed and implemented a systematic program of human exploitation that anticipated later eugenic movements in its logic, if not its specific methods. Her detailed records, clinical language, and methodical approach represent a distinctive form of evil that combines dehumanization with rationality, treating human beings as mere biological material while maintaining meticulous documentation of their suffering. This combination challenges comfortable distinctions between barbarism and civilization, between irrational cruelty and rational planning, suggesting how easily systems of knowledge and record-keeping can become tools of atrocity rather than safeguards against it. Perhaps most disturbing is the recognition that Eleanor operated not outside the plantation system, but within it, extending its logic to extremes that expose the dehumanization inherent in the institution itself. Her breeding program, while exceptional in its methodical nature and inclusion of her own family members, represented an intensification of violations already present in conventional slavery. Control of reproduction, denial of bodily autonomy, transformation of human beings into property. This continuity between normal plantation operations and Eleanor's extreme program raises uncomfortable questions about how systems of oppression enable and normalize individual acts of cruelty, creating contexts where atrocities can occur not as departures from order, but as extensions of existing logic. The Blackwood case thus serves not just as a record of individual pathology, but as a lens through which to view the broader systems that made such pathology possible. The physical traces of Blackthorn Estate have been erased from the landscape, the buildings demolished, the fields repurposed, the very contours of the land altered through subsequent development. Yet something of what occurred there persists. In archives and records, in family histories and folk memories, in the genetic inheritance of descendants, and perhaps in some more intangible form of cultural memory that resists complete erasure. This persistence suggests that some violations leave marks too deep to be completely removed, creating absences and silences that themselves become forms of presence. The Blackwood case, though largely excluded from official histories and public monuments, nevertheless continues to exert influence through these gaps and echoes, reminding us that what is buried is not always truly gone, and what is silenced may still find ways to speak. As Professor Merritt noted in the final entry of his research journal, sealed with his archive materials, the Blackwood case represents not just a historical atrocity, but a kind of wound in our collective understanding of the past, a place where conventional historical methods and narratives break down in the face of systematic horror. Perhaps such wounds serve a necessary purpose, reminding us that history is not simply a matter of documenting facts, but of acknowledging harms that may never be fully repairable, bearing witness to suffering that cannot be fully articulated, and recognizing that some aspects of the past resist both forgetting and complete remembrance. Today, the land that once formed Blackthorn Estate lies divided among commercial developments, residential areas, and agricultural fields, with no visible marker of what occurred there. The documents that record Eleanor's program remain scattered across various archives, accessible primarily to researchers with specific credentials and purposes. The descendants of those subjected to her breeding program have, in many cases, lost direct knowledge of their connection to the site, though genetic and family patterns may still bear its imprint. This dispersal and partial erasure represents neither complete forgetting nor full acknowledgement, but something more ambiguous, a kind of cultural half-remembering that preserves the essence of the violation while obscuring its specifics. Perhaps this ambiguous state itself tells us something important about how societies process histories, too disturbing to fully incorporate into conventional narratives, yet too significant to completely erase. The Blackwood case thus remains suspended between documentation and legend, between historical specificity and archetypal horror, a reminder that some chapters of human history resist closure, continuing to resonate across generations, not despite their partial obscurity, but perhaps because of it, haunting our understanding of both past and present with their unresolved implications.